I first noticed something odd the night of our anniversary dinner. Jenna had always been beautiful, but there was a shift in her lately. A new energy, a glow I couldn't quite place. Her smile seemed brighter, her laughter more frequent. I attributed it to the promotion she'd earned at work or the yoga classes she'd taken up. But deep down, something gnawed at me. That night, she came home from work a little late, as she often did these days. She carried a small bag from an upscale boutique, and when I asked what it was, she smiled coyly. Just something for a project, she said. A work project, I asked. Something like that, she replied, brushing past me with a kiss on my cheek. Jenna's new hobby wasn't entirely a mystery. She'd been raving about her growing interest in art. Last month, we'd gone to an exhibition at the Whitmore Gallery downtown, a showcase for emerging artists. Jenna had been captivated, lingering in front of one particular artist's work. Vibrant canvases filled with swirling colors and shadowy figures. The artist himself, a man named Vincent Moreau, had been present, mingling with guests. He was eccentric, with a mane of unruly black hair and a brooding intensity that made him seem like he'd stepped out of a 19th century painting. Jenna had introduced herself, and they'd fallen into an animated discussion about his process. I'd hovered awkwardly at her side, feeling like an outsider to their conversation. It wasn't jealousy, at least that's what I told myself. Jenna was passionate about art, and Vincent was clearly a master of his craft. Still, when she started attending studio sessions downtown, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. One evening, she returned home beaming, carrying a portfolio case. "Vincent let me take a print home," she exclaimed, pulling out a striking piece. It was an abstract portrait of a woman, her face obscured by streaks of light and shadow, but her posture was unmistakably Jenna's. "Is that you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She laughed a little nervously. "No, of course not. But it's beautiful, isn't it?" I nodded, but something about the painting unsettled me. The way the figure stood, the tilt of her head, it was too familiar. Over the next few weeks, the studio sessions became more frequent. Jenna seemed happier, more vibrant, but also more distant. She spent hours at the gallery, returning home late with flushed cheeks and a faint scent of turpentine clinging to her clothes. One night as we lay in bed, I asked her about Vincent. "He's brilliant," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "His work is so raw. It's like he can see right into your soul." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Do you spend a lot of time with him?" "It's not like that, Daniel," she said, turning to face me. "He's a mentor, someone who inspires me." Her words were reassuring, but the doubt lingered. A few weeks later, I found myself in the Whitmore Gallery, standing in front of one of Vincent's new paintings. It was part of his latest collection, which had been getting rave reviews in the local press. The piece was stunning, an intimate portrait of a woman reclining on a chaise lounge, her body draped in a flowing silk robe. Her face was partially hidden, but her features were hauntingly familiar. It wasn't just the pose or the setting, it was the curve of her lips, the arch of her neck. It was Jenna. I stared at the painting, my mind racing. Had Jenna posed for this? She hadn't mentioned anything about modeling. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said from behind me. I turned to see Vincent standing there, a glass of wine in his hand. "Yes," I said cautiously. "It's incredible. Did you have a particular muse in mind?" His lips curved into a cryptic smile. "Inspiration comes from many places," he said. "Sometimes the muse finds you." I forced a smile, my stomach churning. As Vincent walked away, I turned back to the painting, searching for answers. I needed to know the truth. When I got home that night, Jenna was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled. "How was your day?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. "I stopped by the Whitmore Gallery," I said carefully. Her smile faltered. "Oh? What did you think of the new collection?" "It's, striking," I said. "One painting in particular caught my eye. A woman on a chaise lounge." Jenna froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "Oh," she said softly. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Her eyes darted away and she set the glass down. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said. "Vincent asked me to pose for a few pieces. It's just art, Daniel." Just art? I said, my voice rising. You didn't think I deserved to know about this? I didn't want to upset you, she said, her voice trembling. It's nothing inappropriate, I swear. But as I looked at her, I saw the guilt written across her face. Jenna's words hung in the air like a fragile truce. It's nothing inappropriate, she had said, her voice trembling with just enough conviction to make me question myself. But the image of her likeness in Vincent's painting was burned into my mind. It wasn't just art, it was intimate, vulnerable, and deeply personal. That night, I barely slept. Jenna lay beside me, her breathing slow and steady, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. The memory of her reaction when I brought up the painting replayed in my head like a broken record. She had looked startled, almost frightened, as if I'd stumbled too close to a truth she wasn't ready to share. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. On my lunch break, I returned to the Whitmore Gallery. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt like walking into a cathedral. Vincent's new collection lined the walls, each piece as mesmerizing and enigmatic as the last. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning for any trace of Jenna. The painting I'd seen the day before, the one of the woman on the chaise lounge, was now surrounded by a small plaque that read, "Sold." "Can I help you?" a voice said, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see a young gallery assistant, her polite smile tinged with curiosity. "Actually, yes," I said. "I was here yesterday and noticed this piece. Do you know who bought it?" The assistant hesitated. "I'm afraid I can't share that information," she said, "but it was purchased by a private collector." A private collector. The phrase felt loaded with possibilities, none of them comforting. I thanked her and left, my unease deepening. That evening, Jenna seemed different, more distant, more guarded. She spent most of the night in the spare room she'd converted into an art space. Working on a sketch she refused to let me see. "What are you drawing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just something for fun," she replied without looking up. I lingered in the doorway, watching her work. The way she moved, the way her pencil glided across the page. It was captivating, but it also felt like she was slipping further away from me. A week later, I found myself standing outside Vincent's studio. It was a converted warehouse in an artsy part of town, the kind of place where creativity seemed to ooze from the walls. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I needed answers. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "It's your best work yet," Jenna's voice said. "It's because of you," Vincent replied. "You've inspired me in ways I didn't think were possible." I felt a surge of anger and jealousy. I wanted to burst in, to confront them, but I forced myself to stay calm. Instead, I pulled out my phone and recorded their conversation. "Vincent," Jenna said, her tone hesitant, "I don't think we should keep doing this." "Why not?" he asked. "It's getting complicated," she said. "Art is supposed to be complicated," Vincent replied. "That's what makes it real." Their words felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. I slipped away before they could see me, my mind racing with questions. That night, I confronted Jenna. "Were you at Vincent's studio today?" I asked as we sat down for dinner. She looked up, startled. "What? No, I was at work." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice sharp. "I was there. I heard you." Her face turned pale. "Daniel, I can explain." "Then explain," I snapped. "Because right now it sounds like you're having an affair." Jenna's eyes filled with tears. "It's not what you think," she said. "I swear nothing happened. He's passionate about his work, and I got caught up in it, but it's over now." "Is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because it doesn't feel like it." She reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Daniel, please. I love you. This was never about replacing you. It was about finding a part of myself that I thought I'd lost." Her words stung, but they also gave me pause. Was it possible she was telling the truth? Could this really be about her art and not about Vincent? For the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind, but the doubt lingered. Every time I looked at her, I wondered what she wasn't telling me. And every time I thought about Vincent, I felt a surge of anger I couldn't control. One night, while Jenna was asleep, I opened her sketchbook. I knew it was an invasion of her privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. The first few pages were harmless enough. Landscapes, abstract shapes, studies of light and shadow. But then I turned to a page that made my stomach drop. It was a sketch of Vincent. His face was rendered in painstaking detail, his brooding intensity captured perfectly. And beneath it, in Jenna's handwriting, were the words, "He sees me." I stared at the sketch in Jenna's notebook, my hands trembling. The words she'd written beneath Vincent's portrait, "He sees me," echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain. What did they mean? Was she saying something I couldn't provide? The revelation sat heavy in my chest, a mix of anger and sadness clawing at my insides. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers, but another part, the more cautious part, held me back. If I rushed in without understanding the full scope of what was happening, I risked driving her further away. I closed the sketchbook, placed it back on her desk, and left the room. The next morning, Jenna was unusually quiet. She moved through our home as though she were carrying an invisible weight, her usual cheer replaced with an air of distraction. "Everything okay?" I asked as I poured my coffee. She hesitated, her back to me. "Yeah, just tired. Work's been a lot lately." I didn't push her. Instead, I decided to use her behavior as an opportunity. That afternoon, while she was out, I went back to Vincent's studio. This time, I didn't just linger outside. I stepped in. The space was massive, filled with canvases in various stages of completion. The scent of paint and turpentine hung in the air. There was a chaotic beauty to it, but I wasn't here to admire his work. I spotted him across the room, hunched over a large canvas. He didn't notice me at first, so I took the opportunity to survey the room. On one wall, there was a series of paintings that immediately caught my attention. They were all of Jenna. Each painting was more intimate than the last. In one, she was sitting on a stool, her face turned toward the light, her expression soft and contemplative. In another, she was lying on a chaise lounge, her body partially draped in a thin sheet. The final painting was the most striking. It depicted her standing in the center of the room, completely exposed, her eyes meeting the viewer's gaze with a raw vulnerability. "You like them?" Vincent's voice startled me. I turned to see him standing a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag. "They're powerful," I said, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "She's a remarkable muse," he said, his eyes lighting up. "There's a depth to her that's rare. You're a lucky man." His words felt like a punch to the gut. "Does she know you've painted all of these?" He tilted his head, studying me. "Of course. She's the one who posed for them. And you didn't think to ask how I might feel about it?" I said, my voice tightening. Vincent shrugged. "Art isn't about seeking permission. It's about capturing truth. Jenna understands that." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to hit him. "This isn't just about art, is it?" He smirked, the arrogance in his expression infuriating. "That's a question you'll have to ask your wife." I stormed out of the studio, my thoughts racing. Jenna had lied to me about the paintings, about her time with Vincent, about everything. But why? Was she genuinely attracted to him, or was there something deeper at play? When I got home, Jenna was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up as I walked in, her smile faltering when she saw my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I went to Vincent's studio," I said, cutting straight to the point. Her hands stilled, the knife hovering over the cutting board. "Why?" "I wanted to see his work," I said, my voice heavy with accusation. "You didn't tell me you were posing for him. You didn't tell me he was painting you." Jenna's face paled. "Daniel, do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I snapped. "To see my wife's body on display like that, painted by another man?" "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Then what did you mean to do?" I asked. She took a deep breath, tears welling in her eyes. "Vincent, he made me feel alive. Like I was more than just your wife, more than just a woman who goes to work and comes home to cook dinner. He saw me in a way I haven't felt in years." Her words cut deeper than any betrayal. I wanted to yell, to tell her how selfish she was being, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew there was some truth to what she was saying. That night I slept on the couch. The silence between us was deafening. but I couldn't bring myself to speak to her. I needed time to process what I'd learned, to figure out what this meant for our marriage. But as I lay there in the darkness, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If she needed Vincent to feel alive, what did that say about me? The next morning, Jenna and I moved around the house like strangers inhabiting the same space. She avoided my gaze, and I avoided the urge to lash out. My mind was a storm of questions and doubts, the weight of her confession pressing heavily on my chest. By noon, I decided I couldn't stay cooped up any longer. I grabbed my coat and headed out, leaving a terse note on the kitchen counter. Need some air. Don't wait up. The cold bite of the winter wind was almost refreshing as I walked aimlessly through the city streets. My feet carried me toward the Whitmore Gallery without conscious thought, as if drawn by some invisible force. Inside, the gallery was quiet, the muted hum of a heating system the only sound. I made my way to the corner where Vincent's paintings were displayed, my eyes immediately locking onto the one titled Reverie. It was Jenna, lying on the chaise lounge, her face turned away as if lost in thought. The intimacy of it stung, but what caught my attention was the detail. The curve of her neck, the way her hair spilled over her shoulder, even the faint scar on her wrist from an accident she had as a teenager. This wasn't just art. This was obsession. Back again? A voice said behind me. I turned to see the gallery assistant from before, her expression polite but curious. Yes, I said, trying to sound casual. These pieces are striking. They've been quite the talk, she said, stepping closer, especially the ones of his latest muse. People are always fascinated when art blurs the line with real life. Real life. The phrase echoed in my mind. Do you know much about Vincent? I asked, trying to steer the conversation. She smiled faintly. He's a bit of an enigma, honestly. He keeps to himself, but his work speaks volumes. Though, she hesitated. What? Well, there have been rumors, she said, lowering her voice, about his relationships with his muses. Some people think he gets too involved. I nodded, my suspicions confirmed. When I got home that evening, Jenna was sitting at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open but untouched. She looked up as I entered, her face etched with exhaustion. Where were you? She asked softly. Out, I replied, my tone clipped. Daniel, we need to talk, she said, standing up. No, I said, holding up a hand. You need to talk. I've been trying to understand, trying to make sense of why you do this. But all I get from you are excuses. She flinched but didn't back down. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice breaking, to feel invisible in your own life, to feel like everything you are is wrapped up in someone else's expectations. Invisible, I repeated, anger flaring. I've supported you in everything you've ever done. I've loved you unconditionally. How is that making you invisible? Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't look away. You've loved me, Daniel, but you stopped seeing me a long time ago. Her words hit like a gut punch. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but part of me knew she wasn't. Somewhere along the way, I had taken her presence for granted, assuming that love was enough to sustain us. Why him? I asked, my voice quieter now. Why Vincent? Jenna hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Because he sees me as more than what I am. He sees what I could be. And what about us? I asked. What do you see when you look at us? She looked away, her silence answering the question. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. I left Jenna sitting at the kitchen table, her tears unanswered, and drove aimlessly through the city. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, torn between anger, sadness, and a desperate need to understand. I ended up at a bar, nursing a whiskey as I replayed the events of the past few weeks in my mind. The bartender, an older man with a sympathetic face, leaned over. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, he said. Something like that, I replied. Take it from someone who's been around the block, he said. There's always a choice. You either fight for what you have, or you let it go. But you have to decide. His words stuck with me as I left the bar and drove home. When I walked into the house, Jenna was asleep on the couch, her sketchbook clutched in her hands. I stood there for a long time watching her. She looked peaceful, almost childlike, And for a moment I remembered the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But then I thought of Vincent, of his paintings and of the words Jenna had written beneath his portrait. He sees me. I didn't know if I could ever see her the way he did. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and strained civility. Jenna and I spoke only when necessary, our conversations clipped and devoid of warmth. Each passing moment felt like a new layer of distance settling between us. I didn't know how to bridge the gap, or if I even wanted to try. The nights were the worst. I lay awake in the darkness, my mind looping through every interaction Jenna might have had with Vincent. Was it just art, or had it spiraled into something more? Her words, "he sees me," haunted me. Was that all it took for her to forget everything we'd built together? One evening, as Jenna worked late again, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, but she wasn't going to give them to me willingly. So I did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I went through her things. Her laptop sat on the desk in our shared home office, the screen dark and unassuming. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid and powered it on. I knew her password, one of those trivial things you remember without meaning to. The desktop was cluttered with files, most of them work-related, but one folder caught my eye. It was labeled Studio. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind warning me to stop, but I clicked it anyway. Inside were dozens of photos of Vincent's studio. Some were of the space itself, others of the canvases. But what struck me most were the photos of Jenna. In one, she was sitting on a stool, her head tilted to the side, a playful smile on her lips. In another, she was lying on the chaise lounge, her eyes closed as if lost in a dream. And then there was one that stopped me cold. It was a selfie taken by Vincent. He was shirtless, his arm around Jenna, who was smiling at the camera. They looked comfortable, familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. That night, when Jenna came home, I was waiting for her. She walked through the door, her expression wary when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table. "Hey," she said softly. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat. She set her bag down and sat across from me, her eyes darting nervously. "I went through your laptop," I admitted, watching her reaction carefully. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening as if to protest, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't make this about invasion of privacy or whatever excuse you're about to come up with. I found the photos, Jenna. I saw the one of you and Vincent." She looked down, her face pale. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked, the tension in my chest threatening to snap. Jenna took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "Nothing happened," she said finally. "We're just friends." "Friends?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Friends don't take pictures like that. Friends don't paint intimate portraits of each other. Stop lying to me." "I'm not lying," she insisted, tears brimming in her eyes. "Vincent and we connected, but it wasn't physical. I swear." "Then what was it?" I demanded. "What did he give you that I couldn't?" She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Freedom," she said. "He made me feel free." Her words hit me like a slap. All this time I thought I'd been giving her everything. Stability, love, a home. But to her it had been a cage. I left the house that night, unable to look at her. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to be anywhere but there. I drove aimlessly until I found myself parked outside the Whitmore Gallery. The building was dark, the windows reflecting the streetlights. I stared at it, my mind racing. Vincent was the key to all of this. He had inserted himself into our lives, into Jenna's heart, and I needed to understand why. The next day, I decided to confront him. Vincent was in his studio, working on a new piece when I arrived. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but unreadable. "Daniel," he said, setting down his brush, "this is a surprise." "I want answers," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Answers to what?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "To whatever it is you're doing with my wife," I said, stepping closer. "You've crossed a line, and I want to know why." Vincent tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Your wife came to me," he said. "She wanted to be seen, to be understood. I gave her that." "And what about us?" I snapped. "Did you ever think about what this would do to our marriage?" He shrugged. "Art isn't about boundaries. It's about truth." If the truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why. His arrogance was infuriating, but his words cut deep. Was this my fault? Had I driven Jenna to him? The tension in Vincent's studio was suffocating. The air felt heavy, saturated with unspoken words and the overwhelming smell of turpentine. Vincent stood there, unbothered by my anger, as if he thrived on the chaos he had caused. "You think you're some kind of genius, don't you?" I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "Using people's lives as your canvas, ruining relationships for the sake of your so-called truth." Vincent picked up a rag, wiping his hands as he responded. "Art isn't about destruction, Daniel. It's about revealing what's already broken." I took a step closer, my fist clenched. "And you think my marriage was broken?" He met my gaze, his calm demeanor infuriating. "Not broken, fractured. Jenna saw it, even if you didn't. All I did was hold up a mirror." The words stung more than I cared to admit. I wanted to dismiss him, to write him off as a manipulative narcissist, but part of me couldn't ignore the kernel of truth buried in his arrogance. Had I been so focused on the routine of our life that I failed to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface? I glanced at the canvas he had been working on when I arrived. It wasn't Jenna this time, but the style was unmistakable. Soft yet intense, the brushstrokes full of longing. The subject was a woman, her face half hidden in shadow, her expression one of vulnerability and strength. "Do you even care about her?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Vincent's eyes flicked to the painting before returning to me. "I care about what she represents. She's more than just your wife or my muse. She's possibility." "Possibility," I repeated, the word feeling hollow. "She's a person, Vincent, not an idea, not a project." He didn't reply, and the silence between us felt like a chasm. I left the studio without another word, my mind racing as I drove home. The encounter had done little to quell my anger or answer my questions. If anything, it had only deepened the sense of betrayal. When I got home, Jenna was in the living room, flipping through one of her sketchbooks. She looked up as I entered, her expression guarded. "Where were you?" she asked. "Talking to Vincent," I said, dropping my keys on the table. Her face paled, and she closed the sketchbook with trembling hands. "What did you say to him?" "Enough," I replied, sitting down across from her. "Jenna, I need to know the truth. All of it. No more excuses, no more half-truths. Just tell me what's going on." She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "Then what is it?" I demanded. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she began. "When I met Vincent, it wasn't about this. It was about finding myself again. He saw something in me that I hadn't seen in years." "And what about us?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to us?" "Of course I did," she said, her tears falling freely now. "But Daniel, I was drowning. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to ask for help." Her words cut deeper than any of Vincent's smug observations ever could. She had been suffering, and I hadn't noticed. That night, after Jenna went to bed, I found myself in the garage, staring at the collection of unfinished projects I had accumulated over the years. Shelves of woodworking tools, half-built furniture, and plans for renovations that never materialized. They were a stark reminder of all the ways I had poured my energy into everything but my marriage. I picked up a chisel, its weight familiar in my hand, and turned it over, my thoughts spiraling. Was this salvageable? Could we find our way back to each other, or had too much damage been done? As I stood there, the faint sound of the wind outside the garage brought me back to reality. I set the chisel down and headed inside, determined to face whatever came next. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Jenna to wake up. When she finally came downstairs, she looked surprised to see me. "We need to figure this out," I said, sliding a mug toward her. "I'm not ready to give up on us, Jenna, but I can't do this alone." She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "I don't know if we can fix this, Daniel," she admitted. "Maybe not," I said, "but we won't know unless we try." For the first time in weeks, we sat down and talked, really talked. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but it was a start. The days that followed were a mixture of cautious hope and lingering uncertainty. Jenna and I had started therapy together, a step we both knew was necessary if we were ever going to salvage what was left of our marriage. The sessions were raw, forcing us to confront truths we had avoided for years. Jenna admitted that she had felt invisible, like she was fading into the background of our life together. She didn't blame me outright, but her words carried an undercurrent of accusation I couldn't ignore. I had been so focused on providing, on building a future, that I had lost sight of her in the present. I confessed my own failings, the times I had dismissed her frustrations, assuming they were fleeting. The nights I had stayed late at work, thinking that a paycheck could replace my presence. It was humbling, laying myself bare like that, but it was also necessary. One evening as we sat on the couch together, Jenna turned to me with a hesitant look. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. My stomach tightened, but I nodded for her to continue. "I ended things with Vincent," she said. "I told him I couldn't see him anymore, that I needed to focus on us." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by a lingering wariness. "How did he take it?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not well," she admitted. "He said I was abandoning something beautiful, that I was letting fear hold me back. But I told him it wasn't fear. It was love. I chose you, Daniel." Her words felt like a balm, soothing some of the wounds Vincent's presence had inflicted. But the scars remained, a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. Weeks passed and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Jenna spent less time at the gallery and more time at home, rediscovering hobbies she had abandoned. I made an effort to be more present, to listen when she spoke instead of merely nodding along. But one day as I was organizing the garage, a package arrived. Jenna brought it inside, a puzzled look on her face. "It's from Vincent," she said, holding up the box. A sense of unease crept over me as she set it on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside was a single canvas, carefully wrapped in brown paper. Jenna unfolded it slowly, revealing a painting that made my breath catch. It was her, but not the versions of her I had seen in his studio. Playful, dreamy, or seductive. This was different. She was sitting in a chair, her posture upright, her expression one of quiet determination. Her eyes seemed to pierce through the canvas, filled with a strength I hadn't seen in years. There was a note taped to the back of the frame. Jenna read it aloud. "For Jenna, a final piece to remember what we created. May you never forget the beauty you hold within. EVV." She set the note down, her hands shaking slightly. "What do we do with it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the painting, a mixture of admiration and resentment swirling in my chest. It was a masterpiece, no doubt, but it was also a reminder of everything we had been through. "We keep it," I said finally, "not as a trophy, but as a lesson. This is part of our story now." The painting hung in our living room, a silent witness to our efforts to rebuild. Friends who visited often complimented it, unaware of the history behind it. For Jenna and me, it became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the most fractured things could be mended with enough care. But every now and then, I would catch Jenna staring at it, her expression distant. I knew there were parts of her experience with Vincent that I would never fully understand, pieces of herself that she had shared with him alone. And maybe that was okay. We weren't perfect, we never would be. But we had chosen to stay, to fight for what we had. And in the end, that choice was enough. One day as I was flipping through a magazine, I came across an article about Vincent. He had moved to a new city, his career flourishing after the success of a recent exhibition. The centerpiece of the show was a series of portraits, all featuring women in various stages of vulnerability and strength. The journalist had described his work as intensely personal, a reflection of the connections he forges with his subjects. I closed the magazine, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. Vincent had his art, his acclaim, but I had Jenna, and that was a victory he could never take from me. As the months turned into years, the painting faded into the background of our lives, no longer a point of pain, but a chapter we had survived. Jenna and I continued to grow, learning to love each other not as we had been, but as we were. Because love, I realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about choice, and every day we chose each other.